Section 14 of the Gospel in Brief by Leo Tolstoy. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by K. Hand. Chapter 12. The Victory of the Spirit over the Flesh. Therefore, for him who lives, not the self-life, but a common life in the will of the Father, there is no death. Bodily death is for him union with the Father. Thine is the kingdom, power, and glory. After this, Jesus said, "Now arise, and let us go. Already he is coming who will betray me." And he had hardly said this, when suddenly Judas, one of the 12 disciples, appeared, and with him a great throng of people with sticks and swords. Judas said to them, "I will bring you where he and his followers are, and so that you may know him among them all, he whom I shall first kiss, that is he." And he straightway went up to Jesus and said, "Hail, teacher," and kissed him. And Jesus said to him, "Friend, why are you here?" Then the guards surrounded Jesus and wished to take him. And Peter snatched the sword from the high priest's servant and slashed the man's ear. But Jesus said, "You must not oppose evil. Cease." And he said to Peter, "Return the sword to him from whom you took it. He who shall draw the sword shall perish with the sword." After this, Jesus turned to the crowd and said, "Why have you come out against me as against a robber, with arms? I was every day among you in the temple, and taught you, and you did not take me. But now is your hour and the power of darkness." Then, having seen that he was taken, all the disciples ran away. And the officer ordered the soldiers to take Jesus and bind him. The soldiers bound him, and took him first to Annas. This was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, and Caiaphas was the high priest for that year, and lived in the same house with Annas. This was the same Caiaphas who planned how to destroy Jesus. He held that it was good for the sake of the people to destroy Jesus, because if that were not done, it would be worse for the whole people. And they took Jesus to the house where this high priest lived. When they had brought Jesus thither, one of his disciples, Peter, followed him from afar, and watched where they were taking him. When they brought Jesus into the court of the high priest, Peter went in also, to see how all would end. And a girl in the yard saw Peter, and said to him, "You also were with Jesus of Galilee." Then Peter was afraid that they would accuse him also, and he said aloud before all the people, "I do not know what you are talking about." Afterwards, when they had taken Jesus into the house, Peter also entered the hall with the people. In the hall, a woman was warming herself at the fire, and Peter approached. The woman looked at Peter, and said to the people, "See, this man is likely to have been with Jesus of Nazareth." Peter was still more frightened, and swore that he never was with him, and did not even know what kind of man Jesus was. A little while after, the people came up to Peter and said, "It is quite clear that you also were among the disturbers. By your speech one may know that you are from Galilee." Then Peter began to swear, and aver that he had never known or seen Jesus. And he had hardly said this when the cock crew. And Peter remembered those words which Jesus had said to him, when Peter swore that if all denied Jesus, he would not deny him. "Before the cock crow this night, you will deny me thrice." And Peter went out, and cried bitterly. Jesus had prayed that he might not thus fall into temptation. He had fallen into one temptation, that of strife, when he began to defend Jesus, and into another temptation, the fear of death, when he denied Jesus. And there gathered to the high priest the orthodox chief priests, assistants, and officials. And when all were assembled, they brought in Jesus, and the chief priests asked him what was his teaching, and who were his followers. And Jesus answered, "I always said all I had to say before everybody openly, and so I speak now. I conceal nothing from anyone, and I conceal nothing now. But about what do you question me? Question those who heard and understood my teaching. They will tell you." When Jesus had said this, one of the high priest's servants struck him in the face and said, "To whom are you speaking? Is this the way to answer the high priest?" Jesus said, "If I spoke ill, say what I spoke ill. But if I said nothing ill, then there is no cause to beat me." The orthodox chief priests strove to accuse Jesus, and at first did not find any proofs against him, for which it was possible to condemn him. Afterwards they found 2 witnesses. These said about Jesus, "We ourselves heard how this man said, 'I will destroy this temple of yours made with hands, and in 3 days will build up another temple to God, not made with hands.'" But this evidence also was not enough to condemn him. And therefore the high priest called up Jesus and said, "Why do you not answer their evidence?" Jesus held his tongue, saying nothing. Then the high priest said to him, "Well, say then, are you the Christ, and of God?" Jesus answered him and said, "Yes, I am the Christ, and of God. You yourselves will now see that the Son of Man is made like God." Then the high priest cried out, "You blaspheme! Now we do not want any evidence. We all hear now that you are a blasphemer." And the high priest turned to the assembly and said, You have yourselves heard that he blasphemes God. To what do you sentence him for this?" And all said :" We sentence him to death." Then all the people and the guards fell upon Jesus, and began to spit in his face, to strike him on the cheeks, and to tear at him. They covered his eyes, hit him in the face, and asked :" Now, prophet, guess who it was that hit you?" But Jesus held his peace. Having abused him, they took him bound to Pontius Pilate. And they brought him into the court. Pilate, the governor, came out to them, and asked :" Of what do you accuse this man?" They said :" This man is doing wrong, so we have brought him to you." And Pilate said to them :" But if he does wrong, then judge him yourselves according to your law." And they said :" We have brought him to you that you might execute him, for we are not allowed to kill anyone." And so that happened which Jesus expected. He said that one must be ready to die on the cross at the hands of the Romans more likely than at the hands of the Jews. And when Pilate asked whereof they accused him, they said that he was guilty of stirring up the people, and that he forbade the payment of taxes to Caesar, and that he set himself up as Christ and king. Pilate listened to them, and bade Jesus be brought to him in the court. When Jesus came in, Pilate said to him :" So, you are king of the Jews?" Jesus said to him :" Do you really suppose that I am a king, or are you repeating only that which others have told you?" Pilate said :" I am not a Jew, therefore you cannot be my king, but your people have brought you to me. What kind of man are you?" Jesus answered :" I am a king, but my kingdom is not an earthly one. If I were an earthly king, my subjects would fight for me, and would not yield to the high priests. But as it is, you see that my kingdom is not an earthly one." Pilate said to this :" But yet, do you not consider yourself a king?" Jesus said :" Not only I, but you also, cannot but consider me a king. For I only teach in order to discover all the truth of the kingdom of heaven. And everyone who lives by the truth is a king." Pilate said :" You spoke of truth. What is truth?" And having said this, he turned and went to the chief priests. He went out and said to them :" In my opinion, this man has done no wrong." But the chief priests insisted upon their opinion, and said that he was doing much evil, and stirring up the people, and had raised the whole of Judea right from Galilee. Then Pilate, in the presence of the chief priests, began to question Jesus. But Jesus did not answer. Pilate then said to him :" Do you hear of what they accuse you ? Why do you not justify yourself?" But Jesus still held his tongue, and said not another word, so that Pilate wondered at him. Pilate remembered that Galilee was in the power of King Herod, and asked :" Ah, he is from Galilee?" They answered :" Yes." Then he said :" If he is from Galilee, then he is under the authority of Herod, and I will send him to him." Herod was then in Jerusalem, and Pilate, in order to rid himself, sent Jesus to Herod. When they brought Jesus to Herod, Herod was very glad to see him. He had heard much of him, and wished to know what kind of man he was. So he called Jesus to him, and began to question him about all he wished to know. But Jesus answered him nothing. And the chief priests and teachers, just as with Pilate, so before Herod, vehemently accused Jesus, and said that he was a rioter. And Herod deemed Jesus an empty fellow, and to mock him, bade them clothe him in red, and send him back to Pilate. Herod was pleased at Pilate showing respect to him by sending Jesus for his judgment, and on this account they became friends, whereas formerly they had been at variance. Now when they brought Jesus again to Pilate, Pilate called back the chief priests and Jewish authorities, and said to them :" You brought this man to me for stirring up the people, and I have examined him before you, and do not see that he is a rioter. I sent him with you to Herod, and now see, nothing wrong is found in him. And in my opinion there is no cause to punish him with death. Had you not better punish him and let him go?" But when the chief priests heard this, all cried out :" No, punish him in the Roman fashion, stretch him on the cross." Pilate heard them out, and said to the chief priests :" Well, as you will. But you have a custom at the feast of the Passover to pardon one condemned malefactor. Well, I have lying in prison Barabbas, a murderer and rioter. Which one of the two must be let free, Jesus or Barabbas?" Pilate thus wished to save Jesus. But the chief priests had so worked upon the people, that all cried out :" Barabbas, Barabbas." And Pilate said :" And what shall be done with Jesus?" They again cried out :" Roman fashion, to the cross with him." And Pilate tried to talk them over. He said :" Why do you press so hardly on him ? He has done nothing that he should be punished with death, and he has done you no harm. I will set him free, because I find no fault in him." The chief priests and their servants cried out :" Crucify, crucify him." And Pilate said to them :" If so, then take him and crucify him yourselves, but I see no fault in him." The chief priests answered :" We ask only that which our law demands. By our law he must be executed for having made himself out to be the Son of God." When Pilate heard this word, he was troubled, because he did not know what this term Son of God meant. And having returned to the court, Pilate called up Jesus again, and asked him, "Who are you, and whence are you?" But Jesus did not answer. Then Pilate said, "But why do you not answer me? You surely see that you are in my power, and that I can crucify you or set you free." Jesus answered him, "You have no power. There is power only from above." Pilate nevertheless wished to set Jesus free, and he said to them, "How is it you wish to crucify your king?" But the Jews said to him, "If you set Jesus free, you will thereby show that you are a disloyal servant to Caesar, because he who sets himself up as king is an enemy to Caesar. Our king is Caesar, but crucify this man." And when Pilate heard these words, he understood that he could now no longer refuse to execute Jesus. Then Pilate went out before the Jews, took some water, washed his hands, and said, "I am not guilty of the blood of this just man." And the whole people cried out, "Let his blood be upon us and all our children." So that the chief priests gained the upper hand, and Pilate sat in his place of judgment, and ordered Jesus to be first flogged. When they had flogged him, the soldiers who had done this put a crown upon his head, and a rod in his hand, and threw a red cloak over his back, and fell to reviling him. In mockery, they bowed down to his feet, and said, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And others struck him on the cheeks, over the face, and spat in his face. But the chief priests cried, "Crucify him! Our king is Caesar! Crucify him!" And Pilate bade him be crucified. Then they stripped Jesus of the red dress, put on him his own clothing, and bade him bear the cross to a place called Golgotha, there to be crucified at once. And he carried his cross, and so came to Golgotha. And there they stretched Jesus on the cross, beside two other men. These two were at the sides, and Jesus was in the middle. When they had crucified Jesus, he said, "Father, forgive them, they do not know what they are doing." And when Jesus was hung on the cross, the people thronged round him and railed at him. They came up, wagged their heads at him, and said, "So, you wish to destroy the temple of Jerusalem, and to build it up again in 3 days. Well now, save yourself, come down from the cross." And the chief priests and leaders stood there also, and mocked at him, and said, "He thought to save others, but cannot save himself. Now show that you are the Christ, come down from the cross, and then we will believe you. He said that he was the Son of God, and that God would not forsake him. But how is it that God has now forsaken him?" And the people, and the chief priests, and the soldiers railed at him, and even one of the robbers crucified with him, he too railed at him. One of the robbers, reviling him, said, "If you are a Christ, save yourself and us." But the other robber heard this, and said, "Do you not fear God? You who are yourself on the cross, do you even rail at the innocent? You and I are executed for our deserts, but this man has done no harm." And turning to Jesus, this robber said to him, "Lord, remember me in your kingdom." And Jesus said to him, "Even now you are blessed with me." But at the 9th hour, Jesus, worn out, cried aloud, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani." This means, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" And when the people heard this, they began to say jeeringly, "He is calling the prophet Elias. Let us see whether Elias will come." Afterwards Jesus cried out, "Let me drink." And a man took a sponge, soaked it in vinegar that stood by, and gave it to Jesus on a reed. Jesus sucked the sponge, and cried out in a loud voice, "It is finished. Father, I give up my spirit into your hands." And, letting his head fall, he gave up the ghost. End of Section 14.